There is a small group of people who clearly remember dialing a landline with a spinning wheel and also remember watching the first smartphones quietly reshape everyday life. If you were born between 1975 and 1986, you don't sit comfortably inside the usual generational labels. You're often placed at the very end of Generation X, yet you don't fully identify as a millennial either. Researchers eventually began describing this cohort as a micro-generation, not because it needed a special title, but because the timing was unusually precise. Something distinct happened during those years. You began life in a fully analog world. Boredom was not something you escaped with a swipe. It was something you tolerated. You memorized phone numbers because there was no backup stored in your pocket. If you missed your favorite show, there was no replay button waiting for you. Conversations faded naturally. Moments passed and stayed in memory. There were limits everywhere. And those limits quietly shaped attention, patience, and trust. Then, just as you were stepping into adulthood, the entire environment shifted. Not slowly, not gradually, rapidly. The world went digital while you were still forming your identity. Most generations grow up inside one dominant technological system. They either develop entirely before constant connectivity or entirely within it. But this group crossed the bridge during the exact years when identity, ambition, and worldview are still under construction. Your teenage years looked nothing like your 20s. The contrast between those stages was unusually dramatic compared to most generations. Think about how you made plans in high school. You passed handwritten notes. You called someone's house and hoped their parents wouldn't answer. You agreed on a time and place and simply showed up. If someone was late, you waited. There was no way to send a quick message asking where they were. That required trust. It required reliability. It required a tolerance for uncertainty. Then, almost suddenly, mobile phones became standard. Social platforms appeared one after another. Digital communication multiplied. What used to be 3 ways to reach someone turned into endless channels. And without formal training, you adapted. During those formative years, your brain was still developing. Neuroscience shows that the prefrontal cortex, the region involved in planning, emotional regulation, and adapting to new situations, continues maturing into the mid-20s. In practical terms, you were still neurologically flexible when the technological landscape reorganized itself. You were young enough that learning new systems felt intuitive, but you were old enough to remember life before constant connectivity. Older generations encountered digital systems after their habits were already firmly established, which can sometimes create hesitation. Younger generations never experienced life without the internet at all. But you experienced both worlds fully. That creates a kind of psychological bilingualism. You can hold a long, uninterrupted conversation without feeling the urge to check your phone every few minutes. At the same time, you don't feel intimidated by new platforms or emerging tools. You remember what it felt like to be genuinely unreachable for hours. That absence wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary. And that early baseline shapes more than you might realize. For example, your relationship with privacy is likely different. You grew up in a world where embarrassing moments faded naturally. An awkward haircut, a painful breakup, a reckless night at a party. There's no permanent digital archive attached to those memories. They exist mostly in stories. Psychological research on autobiographical memory suggests that our recollections are fluid. We revise them, we reinterpret them. We emphasize some details and allow others to fade. When experiences are permanently documented and searchable, that natural editing process becomes more complicated. You were not defined by a continuous digital record. Your past had room to soften, to evolve, to be reframed as you matured. That creates a fundamentally different relationship with identity. But here is where the story becomes even more complex. Just as many of you were entering the workforce, the economic climate shifted dramatically. The years that were supposed to establish stability were instead shaped by uncertainty, hiring freezes, and financial anxiety. And experiencing instability at the exact moment you're trying to build independence can shape your outlook in ways that linger far longer than people expect. Experiencing instability during early adulthood is not just a temporary inconvenience. Research on economic stress suggests that uncertainty during this stage can quietly shape long-term attitudes toward money, security, and risk. When the ground feels unstable at the exact moment you were trying to build something solid, caution becomes part of your internal wiring. Even if your situation improves later, a subtle question can remain in the background. What if it shifts again? So this generation carries a very specific combination: You adapted to rapid technological disruption, and you encountered financial unpredictability at the same time. You learned how to pivot, but you also learned not to fully relax. You understand innovation, but you keep an eye on stability. You can embrace change, but you rarely assume it will last. That dual awareness shows up in everyday decisions. It might appear in the way you approach career moves. You're open to growth, but you think carefully before taking big risks. You may value flexibility, yet you still want a safety net. You understand that industries can transform quickly because you've already seen it happen. It also shows up in how you relate to success. For some people, progress feels linear. For you, it may feel more conditional. You build, but you're aware that external forces can interfere. That awareness doesn't make you pessimistic. It makes you measured. And then there's independence. As children, many of you were given space. Your parents didn't track your location through apps. They didn't receive instant notifications about your movements. You figured things out on your own. You managed boredom. You handled small conflicts without constant adult intervention. That built resilience. You learned to entertain yourself, to solve problems without immediate guidance, to tolerate discomfort. But at the same time, you entered adulthood during the early optimism of the internet era. Technology felt exciting. It promised connection, opportunity, and access to information that previous generations never had. So you developed both skepticism and openness. You question narratives, but you still believe in possibility. You value autonomy, but you understand collaboration. You remember slower systems, but you function inside fast ones. This ability to hold contradictions without feeling unstable may be one of the defining psychological traits of this group. You can appreciate modern convenience without dismissing the past. You can recognize the benefits of constant connection while still sensing the cost. You may not romanticize everything that came before, but you don't fully idealize the present either. And sometimes, that creates a quiet feeling of not fully belonging. Too young to fully identify with those who reject digital life. Too old to feel completely native inside algorithm-driven culture. But that in-between position is not confusion, it's perspective. Because when you've experienced both before and after, you develop a broader frame of reference. You've seen what was gained: instant access to information, global communication, endless creative tools. And you've seen what was traded: patience, anonymity, long stretches of uninterrupted presence. That awareness often makes you more reflective. You don't automatically accept that faster is better. You don't assume that visibility equals value. You don't panic when systems evolve because you've already adapted once before. And here's something important. Growing up in transition teaches a subtle psychological skill. It teaches that identity is not fixed to one environment. You learned early that the world you were raised in could transform completely within a decade. That realization can feel destabilizing at first, but over time, it becomes strength. You understand that adaptation does not require losing your core values. It requires adjusting behavior while keeping your center. In a world that continues to accelerate, that skill becomes increasingly relevant, because change is no longer occasional, it's constant. If you recognize yourself in this description, it's not coincidence. It's the imprint of being born at a hinge point in history, not defined by one stable system, but shaped by transition itself. And perhaps the most valuable lesson you absorbed wasn't about technology or economics. It was this: how to move forward when the ground shifts beneath you, how to update your tools without abandoning your identity, how to adapt without dissolving. And in the decades ahead, that balance may matter more than ever.